This is Kol Birama, the podcast of Congregation Ramat Raz 929 Tanakh Project. Join us each day as we study a chapter of Tanakh, building towards completing all 929 together. I'm Rabbi Yoni Zolti, and I'm glad you're here. Bereishit chapter 7. Today's chapter presents a good opportunity to talk about a significant focus of modern biblical scholarship, namely biblical criticism. Biblical criticism is based primarily on a number of good observations about the biblical text. Yes, you heard me correctly. The questions that biblical critics pose are good questions, and they're important in honestly looking at the text itself directly. Chiefly among the concerns for biblical critics is the phenomena of repetitions, what some call doublets, and contradictions. Most famously, biblical critics focus on the various names of God and how they appear in different stories. But in truth, the questions that motivate biblical critics are much more than about God's names. At its heart, it's about surprising repetitions and even contradictions that appear within any given narrative. And the story of the flood is a prime example often used by biblical critics. Let me show you exactly what they refer to. If you read through the end of chapter 6 and chapter 7, you'll find a surprising number of repetitions in the story. We're told towards the end of chapter 6 that God speaks to Noah, tells Noah that because the people in the land have sinned, therefore I will destroy the land. Instead, you shall build an ark. And in verse 18, he tells him, I'm going to protect you and your family, as well as animals, and you should gather 2 animals of each kind, a male and a female, with you onto the boat. Noah does all of this at the end of chapter 6, just as God commands him. Chapter 7 begins. God speaks to Noah and says to him, I've seen that you have been righteous. Now collect from all of the pure animals 7 couples, and all of the impure animals 2. Because in 7 days I will bring a flood and destroy the world. And so Noah does as God commands him. And then Noah, we're told again, we've already been told this before, but Noah, at the age of 600 years old, takes his children and the animals and he goes into the ark. We're then told that, again, Noah goes in at the end of the chapter with his wife and his children and all the animals into the ark. Even the flood story itself keeps having these repetitions over and over again. So, verse 17, we're told that the waters rose and lifted up the ark above the earth. And then, verse 18, the waters grew very much, and the ark went above the water. And verse 19, and the waters went up and covered the mountains and everything under the sky. And they went up for 15 amot. They went up very high and they covered the mountains. Again and again, you keep reading, and it's this constant repetition again and again. Noah himself even seems to leave the teva twice. He himself seems to investigate whether or not the waters have receded enough by sending out the birds. But then he also has to wait for God to command him to send out the birds. God then tells Noah, after Noah brings a offering, that he will no longer destroy the world. And then separately, God later tells Noah that he won't destroy the world and offers to him the sign of the rainbow. So again and again, we have these stories which seem incredibly repetitive, at times even contradictory. At the end of the day, how many animals did Noah bring? Was there 2 each? Or was it 2 of only the impure animals, but 7 of the pure animals? These are good and important questions that appear not only here, but really throughout the Torah, and they need an answer. There are, in effect, 3 general approaches that one can take in dealing with these questions. The first, and the one that's most popular amongst academics, is to ascribe the various contradictions and repetitions to different source texts. In the belief of many academic scholars, the Bible itself, as it's written, is in fact a composite of many different texts. And initially, there were source texts that only had one story. And there were multiple source texts, and each source text had a different part or different story with a different message, different details. And at some later point in history, someone came by and brought different texts together, someone called the redactor, and that individual or group of individuals then brought the stories together. And so every time we see a contradiction or a repetition, that itself is a indication of the various source texts that are part of the current text as we see it. As an explanation for the various problems, it works. It does solve most of the issues. But on the other hand, there are a lot of problems with this particular solution. I won't even begin talking about the theological issues, but even textually, suffice to say that this theory has been around for over a couple centuries, and yet even today, there is no consensus among scholars as to how many different source texts are there. Are there four, the J, E, P, and D, or are there also, up to 16, or is J1, J2, J3? What exactly are the relationship between these source texts? We've, of course, never found any evidence for these source texts anywhere else. There are a lot of problems with it, and suffice it to say, it doesn't solve all the issues. Solution number two to addressing these issues is what many call the harmonious reading. It's to diminish the significance of the various contradictions by pointing out that they're not necessarily contradictions, but rather one place the Torah perhaps is more general, and in somewhere else the Torah is more specific, providing more details. If the Torah is repetitive, that's simply the style of writing. It's a very common style of writing which repeats itself. It's the way that people talk. We repeat ourselves. And so the problems are not really problems. They're not really contradictions. That's the general secondary approach. It's a pretty popular approach, and it certainly has its merit in any given place. The third approach, and it's an approach that I certainly personally am partial to, many of my teachers are partial to as well, is an approach that argues that for the most part, the text itself perhaps does suggest two strands or two different stories. But that's not necessarily because they originate from two different source texts, but because the text itself is complex and wants to tell a story from multiple perspectives. And so, in order to tell the same story from multiple perspectives, the story itself may be told again and again in different ways, each time revealing a different aspect or different perspective that which is to be told. Specifically, in the case of the floods, and here I'm using primarily the work of Mordechai Breuer, who wrote a lot about this topic. The flood stories are divided, in effect, into two different ways of looking at the world. In one view, God's role in the world is as a transcendent deity, a God who is above nature, who controls the world through the rules of nature that God has created. God stands way above the world, looking down, and allows nature to operate as it does usually. In the second model, God is very personally involved in the world. God is immanent. He's present throughout everything. And God has a very close and personal relationship with the people and even the animals on the earth. That would be one way of differentiating between Genesis chapter 1 versus chapter 2. One is the world that's very natural, where God is above creating this perfect world that runs on order, runs on the rules of physics. And chapter 2 and 3, where God is very physical, has a relationship with people and the animals, and is very present in the world. That same dynamic appears again in the story of the flood in both ways. On the one hand, we have a story where God decides that the world itself, the natural order of things, has become corrupt. that the world itself, as created, is not working out. And so everything must be started from scratch. But the entirety of the world will not be destroyed. Instead, God decrees that a select few of each species will survive to repopulate the earth after the flood. And so Noah is tasked with building a sanctuary for himself and for some animals, 2 animals of each type, to allow the earth to be repopulated. Why is Noah chosen? He may be the best of the humans, but he is not chosen because he deserves particularly to stay alive, but rather because God did not intend to wipe out entirely the human race, but simply to begin anew, but allow the rules of nature, the rules of science, to proceed as they did before. And so the story is told from the perspective of a powerful God that's operating from a distance, operating from the rules of science, allowing nature to take its course. That's one story of the flood. The second story of the flood views God's role much more directly. God plays a very direct and personal role and has a relationship with the characters in the story. And God decides that the relationship that God has with the creatures God has created with the humans has been corrupted. And so the world will be destroyed. But Noah is the exception. Noah finds favor in the eyes of God, and God decides, therefore, to save Noah because Noah deserves to be saved. Noah, therefore, is told to bring not only some animals, or 2 animals to repopulate the earth, but also to bring 7 pure animals, because each of the pure animals will be brought then as korbanot, as offerings, that Noah will then bring to God in furthering the relationship that exists between God and this very immanent and personable God that exists. And so in this reading, God destroys the world in a way that's much more immanent, much more personal, and is much more involved. And so this approach, in effect, argues that these 2 perspectives are both true. Both the God of immanence, of relationships, of direct action in the world, as well as the God who is more distant, transcendental, above nature, who acts through the rules of nature. Both of these things are true and need to be represented in the story. And the text does that by interweaving this dynamic and at times complicated story because the different perspectives are needed to provide the total picture. Thank you for joining today's learning. See you tomorrow for the next chapter of Tanakh.